Inside Bergman and Sterling, one of New York's most exclusive boutiques, the air suddenly turned electric. A 64-year-old real estate tycoon named Charles Whitfield Peton III stood frozen in the doorway, his face twisted with rage, his eyes locked onto something that made his blood boil. Two black women being assisted by a white sales clerk. What happened next would echo through the marble floors and crystal chandeliers like a gunshot. Peton stormed across the showroom floor, his expensive shoes clicking against polished tile, and unleashed a torrent of racist venom, so violent that even hardened New Yorkers, people who'd seen segregation, who'd lived through decades of hatred, stood paralyzed. He snatched a silk gown from the younger woman's hands and hurled it to the floor, screaming that it was contaminated. The two women stood there, absorbing every word with forced dignity, then quietly walked out. But here's what Charles Whitfield Peton III didn't know, what nobody in that boutique realized in that moment. He had just publicly humiliated the wife and daughter of Ellsworth, Bumpy Johnson, Harlem's most powerful and feared man, and Bumpy Johnson never forgot. Before we go any further, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below. Where are you watching from right now? To understand what happened that October afternoon and why it mattered so much, you need to understand the world these people were living in. 1964 was a year of transformation in America, at least on paper. Just 3 months earlier, on July 2nd, President Lyndon B. Johnson had signed the Civil Rights Act into law. It was supposed to change everything. No more segregated lunch counters, no more whites-only water fountains, no more legal discrimination in hotels, restaurants, theaters, or stores. The law promised equal access to public spaces for every American, regardless of race. But laws change faster than people do. In Manhattan, especially along Fifth Avenue where old money lived and shopped, the Civil Rights Act was treated less like a moral victory and more like an inconvenience. Store owners complied because they had to, not because they wanted to. They opened their doors to black customers with the same enthusiasm you'd show a health inspector, polite on the surface, resentful underneath. Bergman and Sterling was one of those places. For decades, this boutique had been a temple of exclusivity. It catered to Manhattan's elite, the kind of people who summered in the Hamptons, wintered in Palm Beach, and wouldn't dream of wearing the same gown twice. The store's reputation wasn't just built on expensive merchandise, it was built on who was allowed inside. And for most of its history, that didn't include black people, not as customers. Anyway, when the Civil Rights Act passed, Bergman and Sterling did what it had to do. It quietly began serving black customers. No press release, no celebration, just a reluctant acknowledgement that the old rules no longer applied. The brass and glass doors that had been closed for so long were now technically open to everyone. But walking through those doors as a black person in October 1964, that took courage. The boutique itself was designed to intimidate. High ceilings, marble floors, crystal chandeliers that caught the afternoon light and scattered it across racks of silk, cashmere, and imported fabrics. Everything about the place whispered wealth and exclusivity. The sales clerks moved like ballet dancers, their voices soft and practiced, their smiles carefully calibrated. They knew how to make the right people feel welcome and the wrong people feel small. On that particular Saturday, the store was moderately busy. A handful of white shoppers browsed the racks, their gloved hands brushing against fabrics, their conversations hushed. The atmosphere was what you'd expect, refined, controlled, almost sterile. It was the kind of place where even breathing too loudly felt like a violation. Outside, Fifth Avenue hummed with its usual weekend energy. Yellow cabs honked. Pedestrians window shopped. Street vendors sold pretzels and hot dogs. But inside Bergman and Sterling, time moved differently. Slower, more deliberate. Every transaction felt like a ritual. This was the world Charles Whitfield Peton III belonged to. Old money, old rules, old hatreds. And this was the world. May and Ruthie Johnson were about to walk into two women who had every right to be there, but who would be reminded, violently, that rights on paper don't always translate to respect in practice. What none of them knew, what nobody could have predicted, was that this ordinary Saturday afternoon was about to become a turning point, not just for the people in that store, but for everyone who thought power and privilege made them untouchable. Because in a few hours, Bumpy Johnson would prove that power comes in many forms, and his was the kind that didn't need to raise a fist to destroy a man. At exactly 2:47 p.m., May Johnson and her daughter Ruthie stepped through the brass and glass doors of Bergman and Sterling. They didn't shuffle in nervously. They didn't hesitate at the threshold or glance around for permission. They walked in like they belonged there, because they did. May Johnson was 58 years old, and she carried herself with the kind of elegance that money can't buy. She wore a tailored navy suit that fit her perfectly, paired with a string of pearls that caught the light just right. Her hair was styled immaculately. Her posture was straight. Everything about her presentation said one thing: refinement. She wasn't trying to prove anything to anyone. She simply was. Ruthie, her 9-year-old daughter, was equally striking. She wore a cream-colored dress with white gloves, the kind of outfit you'd see in a fashion magazine. Her movements were graceful, deliberate. She had her mother's poise. That same quiet confidence that comes from knowing your worth regardless of who's watching. These were not women who stumbled into wealth or sophistication. They had been raised with it, lived with it, breathed it. May had spent decades navigating a world that tried to diminish her at every turn, and she had refused to be diminished. She had taught Ruthie the same lesson: hold your head high, speak softly, and never let anyone make you feel less than what you are. When they entered the boutique, a few heads turned. Some shoppers glanced over with curiosity, others with thinly veiled disapproval. A middle-aged woman in a fur stole whispered something to her companion. An older gentleman near the men's section stiffened slightly, then returned to examining cufflinks. But no one said anything. Not yet. A young sales clerk, a white woman in her mid-20s with blonde hair pinned back, approached them. Her smile was nervous but professional. You could see the calculation happening behind her eyes. The store's new policy said she had to serve them, but she wasn't sure how the other customers would react. Still, she did her job. "Good afternoon," she said, her voice polite but cautious. "Is there something I can help you find today?" May smiled warmly. "Yes, thank you. We're looking for evening gowns, something elegant for an upcoming event." The clerk nodded and led them toward the back of the store, where the formal wear was displayed. Ruthie followed, her gloved hand lightly brushing against a rack of silk scarves as they passed. For the next 15 minutes, everything was fine. Tense, yes. Uncomfortable, absolutely, but fine. The clerk showed them several gowns: deep emerald greens, midnight blues, a stunning burgundy number with delicate beading along the neckline. May and Ruthie examined each one carefully, discussing fabrics and cuts in low voices. They were doing exactly what every other customer in that store did: shopping, but the silence around them was heavy. Other shoppers watched from the corners of their eyes. A woman pretending to browse handbags kept glancing over. A man near the register stood with his arms crossed, his jaw tight. The store manager, a thin man in his 50s with slicked back hair, hovered near the front desk, watching the situation like a hawk. May and Ruthie felt it all. The stares, the judgment, the resentment simmering just beneath the surface. But they didn't react. They had been through this before, not in stores, maybe, but in 1,000 other spaces where their presence was tolerated but not welcomed. They knew how to move through hostility with grace. Ruthie held up a silk gown, examining the stitching. "What do you think, Mama?" May stepped closer, running her fingers along the fabric. "It's beautiful. The color would look lovely on you." The sales clerk stood nearby, hands clasped in front of her, trying to appear helpful without drawing too much attention. She was caught between two worlds: the old rules she'd grown up with and the new ones she was legally required to follow. Everything was holding together, barely, like a glass filled just to the brim, one drop away from spilling over. And then, at 3:02 p.m., Charles Whitfield Peton III walked through the door. The glass shattered. May and Ruthie had no idea who he was. They didn't know his name, his reputation, or the kind of man he'd spent his entire life being. All they knew was that the air in the room suddenly changed. The tension that had been simmering quietly exploded into something loud and dangerous. They were about to experience the kind of humiliation that no amount of dignity or grace could shield them from. But what Charles Whitfield Peton III didn't know, what he couldn't possibly have known, was that these two women weren't just anyone. They were family, Bumpy Johnson's family, and that changed everything. Charles Whitfield Peton III was exactly the kind of man his name suggested: old money, Old Manhattan, old hatred. At 64 years old, Peton had spent his entire life at the top of New York's social hierarchy. His grandfather had made a fortune in real estate during the Gilded Age, buying up blocks of Manhattan when land was still cheap and holding on to it as the city exploded around him. His father had expanded that empire, turning raw land into luxury apartments, commercial buildings, and exclusive properties that only the wealthiest New Yorkers could afford. By the time Charles inherited the family business, he didn't have to work hard. The money came in automatically. Rent checks, property sales, investment returns. His wealth was so deeply embedded in the fabric of Manhattan that it practically ran itself. But Peton wasn't content to just collect checks and live quietly. He wanted influence. He wanted to be seen. He wanted everyone to know that he mattered, so he made himself visible in all the right circles. He joined the most exclusive clubs, the kind that didn't advertise, the kind you had to be born into or invited into by people who'd known your family for generations. He attended charity galas where tickets cost more than most people made in a month. He sat on the boards of cultural institutions, not because he cared about art or history, but because it gave him access to power. His name appeared in society columns. His opinions were quoted in business journals. When he walked into a room, people noticed, not because he was charming or brilliant, but because he was Charles Whitfield Peton III, and that name carried weight. But beneath the tailored suits and the polished reputation, Peton was a man fueled by bitterness and rage. He hated the way the world was changing. He hated the Civil Rights Act. He hated the protests, the marches, the demands for equality. To him, it wasn't progress, it was an attack on everything he believed the country should be. He saw integration as contamination. He saw black people demanding their rights as an insult to the natural order of things. And he wasn't quiet about it. In private conversations at his club, over whiskey and cigars, Peton would rant about the destruction of American values. He'd complain that the government was forcing businesses to serve people who didn't belong. He'd predict that within a decade, the country would collapse under the weight of what he called forced equality. His friends, men cut from the same cloth, raised with the same prejudices, would nod along. Some agreed wholeheartedly. Others stayed silent, uncomfortable but unwilling to challenge him. Peton took their silence as agreement. He believed he was untouchable, and why wouldn't he? His wealth insulated him from consequences. His social status gave him a platform. His connections protected him from criticism. He had spent 64 years moving through the world without ever being told no, without ever facing real accountability. If someone challenged him, he could ruin them financially. If someone offended him, he could have them blacklisted from every institution that mattered. If someone crossed him, he had lawyers, politicians, and business partners who would close ranks around him. Charles Whitfield Peton III had never met a problem his money and influence couldn't solve. That Saturday afternoon, he arrived at Bergman and Sterling to pick up 3 custom-tailored suits he'd ordered weeks earlier. It was a routine errand, the kind of thing he did without thinking. He expected to walk in, collect his suits, exchange pleasantries with the manager who knew him by name and always treated him with the deference he believed he deserved, and leave. He did not expect to see 2 black women being assisted by a white sales clerk. The moment he stepped through the door and saw them, something inside him snapped. It wasn't just anger. It was outrage. It was disbelief. It was the feeling of a man who had spent his entire life in control, suddenly confronted with a reality he couldn't accept. To Peton, their presence in that store wasn't just inappropriate, it was an insult, a violation, a symbol of everything he despised about the new America being forced upon him. He didn't stop to think. He didn't consider the consequences. He didn't care who was watching or what anyone might think. Charles Whitfield Peton III did what he had always done when the world didn't bend to his will. He exploded, and in doing so, he made the worst mistake of his life. The change in the room was instant. One moment, Bergman and Sterling was filled with the soft murmur of polite conversation, the rustle of fabric, the quiet hum of wealth conducting its business. The next moment, all of that shattered. Charles Whitfield Peton III didn't walk across the boutique floor, he stormed across it. His face was flushed red, his jaw clenched so tight you could see the muscles working beneath his skin. His eyes were locked on May and Ruthie Johnson, with a hatred so pure, so visceral, that everyone in the store felt it. The sales clerk saw him coming and instinctively stepped back. May and Ruthie turned, confused, as this stranger barreled toward them like a man possessed. And then he started screaming. "What the hell is this?" Peton's voice exploded through the store, loud enough to make the chandeliers seem to tremble. "What are they doing in here?" The word "they" came out like poison. Every conversation stopped. Every shopper froze. The manager near the front desk went pale. May straightened her shoulders, her face carefully neutral. Ruthie's hand tightened around the silk gown she'd been examining. Peton jabbed a finger toward them, his voice rising even louder. "You let these people in here? In this store?" The sales clerk stammered. "Sir, the new law says we have to." "I don't give a damn about any law," Peton roared. "This is Bergman and Sterling. This store has standards. This store has a reputation, and you're going to let it be destroyed by—" He unleashed a string of slurs so vile, so hateful, that even the other white customers, people who had grown up in segregated America, people who had their own prejudices, looked away in discomfort. One woman actually gasped. A man near the register shifted his weight, his face tight with secondhand embarrassment, but no one intervened. No one told him to stop. No one defended May and Ruthie. Peton wasn't finished. He turned his rage directly on the two women, stepping so close that Ruthie instinctively moved back. "Where did you even get the money for a place like this? You steal it? You take it from some government handout?" May's voice was quiet but firm. "Sir, we're just shopping. We have every right to." "Rights?" Peton's laugh was cruel and sharp. "You think that piece of paper they signed in Washington gives you the right to be here? To stand where decent people shop? To touch things with your—" He didn't finish the sentence. Instead, he reached out and snatched the silk gown from Ruthie's hands so violently that she stumbled backward. May caught her daughter's arm, steadying her. Peton held the gown up like it was evidence in a trial, his face twisted with disgust. Then he threw it to the floor. "Contaminated," he spat. "You've contaminated it. Just like you people contaminate everything you touch." The gown lay crumpled on the marble floor, a pool of emerald silk that no one moved to pick up. Ruthie's eyes were wet, but she didn't cry. May's jaw was set, her hands trembling slightly, but her voice stayed steady. "We're leaving," May said quietly. "Damn right you're leaving," Peton shot back. He turned toward the manager, who stood frozen behind the front desk like a deer caught in headlights. "And you better get your policies straight. I've been a customer here for 30 years. 30 years. My father shopped here. My grandfather shopped here. And I will not spend another dime in this store if you're going to let it turn into some kind of—" He used another slur, worse than the first. May took Ruthie's hand. "Come on, baby." They walked toward the door with as much dignity as they could gather, their heads high, their steps measured, but everyone in that store could see the humiliation radiating off them. Everyone could see the way Ruthie's shoulders shook slightly. Everyone could see the way May's grip on her daughter's hand tightened with every step. And Charles Whitfield Peton III followed them. He followed them all the way to the brass and glass doors, still shouting, still spewing hatred, still convinced that he was in the right. He stood in the doorway as they stepped out onto Fifth Avenue, his voice carrying into the street. "Don't come back," he yelled after them. "You hear me? Don't ever come back." A few pedestrians stopped and stared. A cab driver slowed down, craning his neck to see what the commotion was about. But May and Ruthie didn't look back. They just kept walking, side by side, until they disappeared into the crowd. Inside the boutique, silence settled like dust after an explosion. The other shoppers slowly returned to browsing, though their movements were stiff and uncomfortable. The sales clerk stood near the rack of evening gowns, her face pale, her hands shaking. The manager finally moved from behind the desk, walking over to pick up the silk gown from the floor. Peton straightened his tie, his breathing still heavy, his face still flushed. But there was satisfaction in his eyes. He had made his point. He had defended what he believed was right. He had put those women in their place. He walked to the counter to collect his custom suits, and the manager handed them over without a word. Peton paid, tipped his hat to no one in particular, and walked out into the October afternoon feeling victorious. He had no idea what he'd just set in motion. He had no idea that in a few hours, May and Ruthie would be standing in a small office above the Palm Cafe in Harlem, recounting every word, every gesture, every moment of that humiliation to a man who didn't forgive and didn't forget. Charles Whitfield Peton III walked out of Bergman and Sterling that day believing he was untouchable. He was wrong. Hey, real quick, what time is it where you are right now? Drop it in the comments. And if you're feeling this story, hit that like button. Trust me, you're going to want to see what happens next. To understand what happened next, you need to understand who Bumpy Johnson was. Not the legend, not the myth, the man. Ellsworth Raymond Bumpy Johnson was born in Charleston, South Carolina, in 1905. He moved to Harlem as a teenager and quickly learned that survival in New York required more than hard work and good intentions. It required power. And in Harlem during the 1,920 seconds and 30 seconds, power came from the streets. Bumpy didn't stumble into the criminal underworld, he built himself a place in it. He was smart, strategic, and ruthless when he needed to be. But what set him apart from other criminals wasn't just his willingness to use violence. It was his ability to avoid it when something smarter would work better. By the 1,940 seconds and 50 seconds, Bumpy Johnson controlled significant portions of Harlem's illegal economy. Numbers running, gambling, protection rackets. He had his hands in everything that made money, and he ran it all with an efficiency that would have impressed any Fortune 500 CEO. But Bumpy wasn't just a gangster. He was a community figure. In Harlem, where black people were systematically excluded from legitimate economic opportunities, where banks wouldn't give loans and businesses wouldn't hire, Bumpy provided what the system refused to offer. He gave people jobs. He loaned money to families who couldn't get it anywhere else. He made sure kids in the neighborhood had food and clothes. He funded local businesses that would have collapsed without his backing. Was it legal? No. Was it moral? That depends on who you ask. But to the people of Harlem, Bumpy Johnson wasn't just a criminal, he was a protector, a provider, someone who looked out for his own when nobody else would. He also had a code. Bumpy didn't tolerate disrespect, not toward himself, and especially not toward his family. He believed in loyalty above all else. If you were loyal to him, he'd move heaven and earth to protect you. If you crossed him, you'd learn very quickly that Bumpy Johnson's memory was long and his reach was longer. But here's the thing about Bumpy that most people didn't understand. He didn't lead with violence. He led with intelligence. Sure, he could be brutal when the situation called for it. He'd grown up in a world where weakness got you killed, and he'd done what he had to do to survive. But Bumpy understood something that a lot of street criminals never figured out. Violence was expensive. It drew attention. It created enemies. It made you a target for law enforcement. Smarter to control people without ever laying a hand on them. Smarter to destroy someone's life so completely that they'd wish you just hit them instead. That's the kind of power Bumpy Johnson wielded. In 1963, after serving time in federal prison on drug-related charges, Bumpy was released. He came back to Harlem quieter than before. Older, more careful. The world had changed while he was locked up. The civil rights movement was gaining momentum. New players were rising in the criminal underworld. The old rules were shifting. But Bumpy adapted. He always did. He reconnected with old allies. He rebuilt relationships that had frayed during his absence. He reestablished his influence, not through loud displays of power, but through quiet conversations, strategic partnerships, and carefully placed favors. Within months, people in Harlem knew Bumpy was back, and with him came his family. May Johnson, his wife, was the kind of woman who could have thrived in any world. She was educated, elegant, and fiercely intelligent. She had stood by Bumpy through decades of chaos, through arrests and prison sentences and constant danger. She had raised their daughter, Ruthie, to be strong, dignified, and unshakable. Bumpy adored them both. In a life filled with violence and betrayal, with shifting alliances and constant threats, May and Ruthie were his constants. They were the people he protected above all else. They were the reason he worked so hard to build something that would last. They were his family, and in Bumpy Johnson's world, family was sacred. So when May and Ruthie walked into his office above the Palm Cafe that October evening, when they stood in front of him with their dignity bruised and their pride wounded, Bumpy didn't need to hear the whole story to know what had happened. He saw it in May's eyes. He saw it in the way Ruthie's hands trembled slightly as she recounted the details. He saw it in the careful way they both tried to downplay the humiliation, as if protecting him from the weight of it. But Bumpy Johnson didn't need protecting. He listened without interrupting. His face remained calm, almost expressionless, but anyone who knew him really knew him would have recognized the stillness in his posture, the way his jaw tightened just slightly, the cold calculation happening behind his eyes. May told him about walking into Bergman and Sterling, about the 15 minutes of uneasy shopping, about the man who stormed across the floor and unleashed a hatred so raw it left scars you couldn't see. She told him about the slurs, the accusations, the silk gown thrown to the floor. She told him about being followed to the door, about the shouting that chased them onto Fifth Avenue, about the way every person in that store had watched and done nothing. When she finished, the room was silent. Ruthie looked at her father, waiting for him to explode, waiting for him to rage, waiting for him to promise violence. But Bumpy didn't explode. He stood up slowly, walked to the window, and looked out over Harlem. The streets below were alive with evening energy, people heading home from work, kids playing stickball, music drifting from open windows. Then he turned back to his wife and daughter, and when he spoke, his voice was quiet, calm, absolute. "Go home," he said. "I'll handle it." May nodded. She knew better than to ask questions. She knew that tone. She knew what it meant. Ruthie hesitated, then followed her mother out. The door closed behind them, and Bumpy Johnson stood alone in his office, staring at nothing. Charles Whitfield Peton III had just made the worst mistake of his life. He had humiliated the wrong family. And now, Bumpy was going to teach him a lesson about power, the kind of lesson you don't survive. The Palm Cafe sat on 125th Street, right in the heart of Harlem. During the day, it was a legitimate business, a restaurant where locals grabbed breakfast, where musicians stopped in after late-night gigs, where neighborhood folks gathered to talk politics and gossip over coffee. But upstairs, in the office above the cafe, a different kind of business happened. That's where Bumpy Johnson conducted the operations that kept Harlem running. That's where deals were made, disputes were settled, and strategies were planned. That's where power lived. And on that October evening, as the sun set over Manhattan and the streetlights began to flicker on, that office became a war room. Within an hour of May and Ruthie leaving, 3 men arrived. They didn't knock. They didn't announce themselves. They just walked in, closed the door behind them, and waited. These weren't street thugs. These were Bumpy's most trusted advisors, men who had been with him for decades, men who understood that the real power wasn't in muscle, it was in information. Bumpy didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Charles Whitfield Peton III," he said, his voice flat and cold. "I want to know everything about him. Where he lives, where he works, who he does business with, who he owes money to, who owes him. I want his bank accounts, his properties, his investments. I want to know every person he's connected to and every secret he's tried to bury." One of the men nodded. "How fast you need it?" "Yesterday," Bumpy said. The men left without another word. Bumpy sat back down at his desk and lit a cigarette. The smoke curled up toward the ceiling as he stared at the wall, his mind already working through possibilities, strategies, pressure points. He wasn't angry. Not in the way most people get angry, loud, impulsive, reckless. Bumpy's anger was different. It was cold, calculated, surgical. He had learned a long time ago that revenge delivered in the heat of the moment was satisfying but short-lived. Real revenge, the kind that destroyed a man, completely required patience. It required planning. It required understanding your enemy better than they understood themselves. And then it required dismantling them piece by piece until there was nothing left. Bumpy had built an empire on that principle. He had outlasted rivals who were stronger, richer, and more violent than him because he understood something they didn't. Power isn't about how hard you can hit. It's about knowing exactly where to apply pressure so that everything collapses. Charles Whitfield Peton III thought his wealth made him untouchable. He thought his name, his connections, his social status were armor that couldn't be pierced. Bumpy was about to prove him wrong. Over the next 48 hours, information poured in. Peton owned 17 properties across Manhattan, luxury apartments, commercial buildings, a few brownstones in exclusive neighborhoods. Most of them were inherited, passed down through generations of Petons who had built their fortune on land acquisition and strategic investments. He had accounts at 3 different banks. His net worth, on paper, was somewhere north of $8 million, a staggering amount in 1964. He sat on the boards of 2 cultural institutions and 1 private investment firm. He was a member of 4 exclusive clubs, including one that still unofficially barred Jewish and black members despite the new laws. He had business relationships with some of the most powerful people in New York, real estate developers, politicians, old money families, who controlled significant portions of the city's economy. On the surface, Charles Whitfield Peton III looked bulletproof. But Bumpy's people dug deeper, and that's when the cracks started to show. Peton's fortune, while substantial, wasn't as secure as it appeared. Several of his properties were leveraged, meaning he'd taken out loans against them to finance other investments. Those loans were held by banks that depended on confidence and reputation. If that confidence wavered, the banks could call in those loans. And if Peton couldn't pay them back immediately, he'd be forced to sell properties at a loss. His business partnerships were built on relationships that went back decades, but relationships could be fragile. A whisper in the right ear, a favor called in, a subtle suggestion that doing business with Peton might not be wise. That's all it would take to start unraveling those connections. His reputation in Manhattan's elite circles was built on the perception of stability, success, and untouchable status. But reputations could be destroyed faster than they were built. One scandal, one public embarrassment, one hint that Peton was no longer the man people thought he was. Bumpy studied the reports, his cigarette burning down to ash in the tray beside him. He didn't need to kill Charles Whitfield Peton III. He didn't need to hurt him physically. He didn't even need to confront him. All he needed to do was pull the right threads and watch the man's entire life unravel. Bumpy leaned back in his chair and smiled, not with joy, but with the cold satisfaction of a chess player who'd just seen the endgame 20 moves ahead. "Start with the banks," he said to one of his men. "I want them nervous. I want them asking questions. I want them looking at Peton's accounts like he's a risk. Then, the business partners. Quiet conversations. Nothing obvious. Just enough to make them wonder if staying connected to him is worth the trouble. And the clubs. The social circles. I want rumors. I want whispers. I want people talking about Peton like he's already finished." The man nodded, taking notes. Bumpy stubbed out his cigarette and stood up. "No violence," he said firmly. "No threats. No direct contact. I don't want my name anywhere near this. I want Charles Whitfield Peton III to wake up one morning and realize his entire world is falling apart, and he won't have any idea why." He walked to the window and looked out over Harlem again, the streets below glowing under the streetlights. And when he's lost everything, when he's broken and desperate and begging for answers, that's when he'll understand. Bumpy turned back to his men, his voice quiet but absolute. "You don't humiliate my family and walk away. Before we see how this all plays out, drop a comment and let me know. What's the weather like where you are today? And if you haven't already, smash that like button. This story's about to get real." Bumpy Johnson had spent his entire life understanding one fundamental truth. Violence was easy, but power was elegant. Any fool with a gun could walk up to someone and pull a trigger. Any hothead with a temper could throw a punch or make a threat. That kind of revenge was immediate, visceral, satisfying in the moment, but it was also messy. It drew attention. It brought police. It created martyrs. Bumpy had watched countless men destroy themselves by acting on impulse, by letting rage dictate their moves. They'd get their revenge, sure, but then they'd spend the rest of their lives looking over their shoulders, waiting for retaliation, waiting for the law to catch up. That wasn't power. That was weakness disguised as strength. Real power, the kind that lasted, the kind that sent a message no one would forget, required patience, precision, and an understanding of how the world actually worked. And Bumpy Johnson understood exactly how the world worked. He understood that wealthy men like Charles Whitfield Peton III didn't fear physical violence. They had security. They had lawyers. They had the entire system built to protect them. A beating would heal. A threat could be reported. Violence would only make Peton a victim, and victims got sympathy. No. What men like Peton feared, what they truly couldn't survive, was losing everything they believed made them untouchable. Their wealth, their status, their reputation, their sense of control. Strip those away, and men like Peton didn't just fall, they shattered. So Bumpy built his plan around that principle. He wasn't going to touch Peton. He wasn't going to threaten him. He wasn't even going to let Peton know he existed. Instead, he was going to systematically dismantle every pillar that held up Peton's life, one by one, until the man collapsed under the weight of his own ruin. and he was going to do it in a way that left no fingerprints. The first pillar, financial stability. Peton's wealth looked impressive on paper, but Bumpy's people had identified the vulnerabilities. Several of Peton's properties were mortgaged. He had outstanding loans. His cash flow depended on rent payments from tenants and returns from investments that required confidence and stability. Bumpy's move was simple: create doubt. He had connections everywhere, including people who worked in banks, people who processed loan applications, people who sat in meetings where financial decisions were made. A word here, a question there. Nothing direct, nothing traceable. I heard Peton's having some trouble with his properties. Someone told me his tenants are looking to break their leases. You think his investments are as solid as they look? Doubt is a virus. Once it's planted, it spreads, and in the world of finance, doubt is deadly. Within days, the banks that held Peton's loans started asking questions. Not aggressive questions, just routine follow-ups. We'd like to review your portfolio. Can you provide updated financial statements? We're conducting a standard risk assessment. To Peton, it would seem like normal business. Annoying, maybe, but nothing to panic about. But behind the scenes, those questions were the first cracks in the foundation. The second pillar, business relationships. Peton's empire wasn't just built on his own money, it was built on partnerships, collaborations, and deals with other powerful people. Real estate developers who worked with him on projects, investors who trusted him with their money, contractors who depended on his business. Those relationships were built on mutual benefit and trust. But trust, like doubt, could be manipulated. Bumpy had spent decades building a network that stretched far beyond Harlem. He had connections in construction, in real estate, in labor unions, in city government. He knew people who knew people, and more importantly, he knew how to call in favors without anyone realizing where the request originated. A union leader who owed Bumpy a favor suddenly had concerns about working on Peton's next project. We're stretched thin right now. Might need to pull our guys off that job. A developer who'd been considering a partnership with Peton got a quiet warning from a trusted associate. I'd be careful with that one. Word is he's overextended. Might not be the safest bet right now. An investor who'd been planning to back one of Peton's ventures had a conversation over drinks with someone who casually mentioned, "You hear about the trouble Peton's been having?" Probably nothing, but you know how these things go. None of it was loud. None of it was obvious. But piece by piece, Peton's network started to pull away. The third pillar, social standing. For men like Charles Whitfield, Peton III, reputation was everything. It determined who invited you to their parties, who accepted you into their clubs, who treated you with respect. Lose your reputation, and you lost your place in the world that mattered to you. Bumpy understood that world better than Peton probably understood it himself. He knew that Manhattan's elite operated on perception. You were only as powerful as people believed you were, and belief could be shaken. Rumors started circulating. Quiet ones, the kind that spread through whispered conversations at cocktail parties and private dinners. Did you hear Peton had some kind of outburst at Bergman and Sterling? Apparently he made quite a scene. I heard his finances aren't as solid as everyone thought. Someone told me he's losing business partners left and right. You think he's in trouble? Again, nothing direct. Nothing that could be traced back to Bumpy or anyone connected to him. Just whispers. Just questions. Just enough to make people wonder. And once people started wondering, they started distancing themselves. Invitations that would have been automatic suddenly didn't come. Calls that would have been returned went unanswered. Meetings that would have been scheduled got postponed indefinitely. Peton's world was shrinking. And he didn't even realize it yet. The fourth pillar, legal pressure. Bumpy had people who knew how to dig. And when you dug deep enough into anyone's business dealings, especially someone who'd been operating for decades with the confidence of untouchability, you found things. Unpaid taxes, building code violations that had been overlooked, contracts that hadn't been filed properly, tenants who'd been mistreated. Small things. Things that powerful men usually got away with because no one bothered to look. But now people were looking. An anonymous tip to the city about building violations at one of Peton's properties. A quiet suggestion to the IRS that maybe Peton's tax filings deserved a closer review. A tenant who'd been wrongfully evicted suddenly finding a lawyer willing to take the case. None of it was fabricated. It was all real. Bumpy's people just made sure the right authorities were paying attention. And once the legal system started moving, it was hard to stop. Bumpy sat in his office above the Palm Cafe, reviewing the plan one more time. Every piece was in motion, every pressure point was being applied. And the beauty of it was that none of it pointed back to him. To the outside world, Charles Whitfield Peton III was simply having a run of bad luck. Business troubles, financial stress, legal complications. It happened to people all the time. But Bumpy knew the truth. This wasn't luck. This was precision. This was power. And Charles Whitfield Peton III was about to learn that there were forces in this world far more dangerous than anything he'd ever imagined. Forces that didn't need to raise a fist to destroy you. The first sign that something was wrong came exactly 1 week after the incident at Bergman and Sterling. Charles Whitfield Peton III was sitting in his study, a room lined with leather-bound books he'd never read and expensive art he'd inherited when his secretary called with unexpected news. Henderson and Associates, a development firm he'd worked with for over a decade, was pulling out of their joint venture on a commercial property in Midtown. No explanation, just a polite letter citing unforeseen complications and a check returning his initial investment. Peton was annoyed but not concerned. Business partnerships fell through sometimes. It was inconvenient, but hardly catastrophic. He'd find another partner. He always did. 3 days later, it happened again. Another longtime business associate, this one, a contractor who'd built half of Peton's residential properties, called to say he wouldn't be available for their next project. "We're overbooked," the man said, his voice apologetic but firm. "Maybe next year." Peton hung up the phone with a frown. Twice in 1 week was unusual, but still, nothing to panic about. Then the banks started calling. First it was Morgan Guaranty Trust, where Peton had held accounts for 30 years. A vice president he'd never spoken to before requested a meeting to review his loan portfolio. The tone was professional, but there was something underneath it, a cautiousness that hadn't been there before. Then Chemical Bank called with similar concerns. They wanted updated financial statements. They wanted to discuss his outstanding mortgages. They wanted reassurances. Peton provided everything they asked for. Irritated but compliant. His finances were solid. He had nothing to hide. This was just bureaucratic nonsense. The kind of thing that happened when new regulations came down from Washington. But the meetings didn't go the way he expected. The bankers asked pointed questions. They wanted to know about his cash flow. They wanted to know about his tenants. They wanted to know if he anticipated any difficulties meeting his obligations. "Of course not," Peton said, his voice edged with indignation. "I've been banking with you for 3 decades. My credit is impeccable." The bankers nodded politely, but their eyes said something different. Their eyes said, "We're not so sure anymore." By the end of the second week, Peton's irritation had turned to unease. 2 more business partners had quietly distanced themselves. One of his investment advisors had suggested gently, almost apologetically, that perhaps Peton should consider consolidating his assets and reducing his exposure. His calls weren't being returned as quickly as they used to be. Meetings that should have been formalities suddenly required multiple follow-ups. People who used to greet him warmly at his club now offered tight smiles and quick excuses to move along. Something was happening. He could feel it, but he couldn't identify what. Week 3 brought the real damage. One of Peton's largest tenants, a law firm that had leased an entire floor of one of his commercial buildings for 15 years, announced they were breaking their lease early. They cited internal restructuring and paid the penalty without complaint. Then another tenant gave notice. Then another. Within 10 days, 3 of his most profitable properties had significant vacancies. And in Manhattan's competitive real estate market, empty space meant lost revenue. It meant mortgage payments coming out of his own pocket instead of being covered by rent. Peton tried to fill the vacancies, but prospective tenants kept finding reasons to look elsewhere. The space was too small. The location wasn't quite right. They decided to go in a different direction. Excuses, all of them. But Peton couldn't prove anything. His financial cushion, the one he'd always relied on, started to thin. Then the legal problems started. A building inspector showed up unannounced at one of his properties and found code violations. Minor things, mostly outdated wiring, insufficient fire exits, paperwork that hadn't been filed correctly. The kind of things that existed in half the buildings in Manhattan but rarely got enforced. Except now they were being enforced. Peton was hit with fines, orders to make repairs, deadlines that seemed unreasonably short. He hired lawyers, Of course, he always hired lawyers. But the legal fees added up quickly, and the problems kept multiplying. A former tenant filed a lawsuit claiming wrongful eviction. Another claimed unsafe living conditions. The cases were weak. Peton's lawyers assured him of that, but they still had to be defended. And defense cost money. Then the IRS sent a letter. They were auditing his tax returns for the past 3 years. Routine, the letter said. But Peton knew better. IRS audits were never routine. They were expensive, time-consuming, and stressful. Even if you'd done nothing wrong, an audit could tie you up for months and cost tens of thousands in accounting fees. By the end of week 4, Charles Whitfield Peton III was no longer annoyed. He was scared. His cash reserves were draining faster than he'd anticipated. The mortgage payments on his properties were coming due, and without rental income, he was covering them out of pocket. The legal fees were piling up. The repairs mandated by the city were expensive and urgent. And worst of all, the banks were getting nervous. Morgan Guaranty Trust called in one of his loans. Not all of them, just one. But it was a significant amount, and they wanted it paid within 60 days. Peton scrambled. He liquidated some investments, at a loss. He borrowed from other accounts. He called in favors from people he thought were friends. But the favors didn't come through the way they used to. People were polite but distant. They had their own concerns. They couldn't help right now. Maybe later. Peton started to realize that later meant never. His reputation, the thing he'd spent his entire life building and maintaining, was crumbling. People were talking. Not loudly, not publicly, but in the quiet spaces where Manhattan's elite made their real decisions. Charles Whitfield Peton III was becoming a liability. No one wanted to be associated with a man who was struggling. No one wanted to be connected to someone whose empire was collapsing. And so they pulled away. Invitations stopped coming. His calls went unreturned. The clubs he'd belonged to for decades suddenly had scheduling conflicts. When he tried to reserve private rooms, he was being erased. Slowly, quietly, completely. By week 6, Peton was desperate. He'd sold 2 properties at a loss just to cover his debts. He'd laid off staff. He'd cut back on every expense he could think of. But it wasn't enough. The banks were circling. More loans were being called in. More tenants were leaving. More legal problems were emerging. Peton sat in his study one evening, surrounded by the trappings of wealth that no longer felt secure, and tried to understand what had happened. He replayed the last 2 months in his mind, searching for the moment when everything started to go wrong, searching for the mistake he'd made, the enemy he'd created, the reason his entire world was falling apart. But he couldn't find it. There was no single catastrophic event, no obvious villain, no clear explanation, just a slow, relentless unraveling that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. What Charles Whitfield Peton III didn't know, what he would never know, was that every single piece of his destruction had been carefully orchestrated by a man he'd never met, a man whose wife and daughter he'd humiliated in a boutique on Fifth Avenue, a man who didn't need to raise his voice or his fist to destroy you, a man named Bumpy Johnson. And by the time Peton finally understood what had happened, it would be far too late. By the end of October, just 6 weeks after the incident at Bergman and Sterling, Charles Whitfield Peton III was finished. Not dead, not physically harmed, but finished in every way that mattered to a man like him. He'd been forced to sell 8 of his 17 properties, most of them at significant losses because buyers could smell desperation. The money from those sales went straight to the banks to cover the loans they'd called in. What little remained went to lawyers, accountants, and the IRS. His business network had evaporated. The partnerships that had taken decades to build were gone. The investors who trusted him had moved on. The contractors who depended on his projects had found other clients. His social standing, the thing he'd valued almost as much as his wealth, was destroyed. The clubs that had once welcomed him now made excuses. The charity galas that had once featured his name on donor lists no longer sent invitations. The society columns that had once mentioned him in glowing terms now ignored him entirely. He'd become invisible, irrelevant. A cautionary tale whispered about in the same circles that used to celebrate him. Did you hear what happened to Peton? Lost everything in a matter of weeks. Poor financial management, apparently. Overextended himself. Should have been more careful. That's what people said. That's what they believed. No one suspected the truth. No one connected his downfall to a confrontation in a boutique. No one knew that his destruction had been engineered by a man in Harlem who'd never spoken his name aloud. By mid-November, Peton left Manhattan. He didn't announce it. He didn't say goodbye. He just quietly packed up what remained of his life and disappeared. Some said he moved to Connecticut to live with a distant relative. Others heard he'd gone to Florida, trying to start over in a place where no one knew his name. It didn't matter where he went. What mattered was that he was gone. Charles Whitfield, Peton III, a man who'd spent 64 years believing he was untouchable, had been erased from the world he'd once dominated, and he never understood why. Up in Harlem, life continued as it always had. Bumpy Johnson sat in his office above the Palm Cafe, reading the newspaper and smoking a cigarette. There was a small article buried on page 12 about a prominent real estate investor who'd suffered unexpected financial difficulties and left the city. Bumpy read it once, then turned the page. He didn't gloat. He didn't celebrate. He didn't even mention it to anyone. The message had been sent. The lesson had been taught. That was enough. But the impact of what Bumpy had done rippled far beyond one man's destruction. Word spread through Harlem, not the details, but the essence. People knew that something had happened. They knew that a wealthy white man had disrespected Bumpy's family, and that man had paid a price. They didn't know how. They didn't know the mechanics, but they knew the result. And the result sent a message that resonated through every neighborhood, every business, every conversation. We are not powerless. In 1964, Black Americans were fighting for rights that should have been guaranteed from the beginning. They were marching. They were protesting. They were demanding to be treated with dignity and respect. The Civil Rights Act had been signed, but the reality on the ground was still hostile, still dangerous, still filled with people like Charles Whitfield Peton III, who believed their hatred was justified. What Bumpy Johnson did to Peton didn't change the law. It didn't end racism. It didn't solve the systemic problems that Black people faced every single day, but it proved something important. Power wasn't just about money, or status, or skin color. Power was about strategy, intelligence, and the willingness to use every tool at your disposal to protect what mattered. Bumpy had shown that you didn't need to meet hatred with violence. You didn't need to stoop to the level of the people who tried to dehumanize you. You could be smarter. You could be more strategic. You could dismantle your enemies so completely that they'd never even know what hit them. That lesson mattered. It mattered to the people in Harlem who'd been told their entire lives that they were powerless against the system. It mattered to the families who'd suffered indignities and humiliations with no recourse. It mattered to anyone who'd ever been made to feel small by someone who thought their privilege made them invincible. Bumpy Johnson had proven that privilege wasn't armor. It was a weakness. Because the higher you built your life, the farther you had to fall. There's a broader lesson here. One that extends beyond Bumpy Johnson and Charles Whitfield Peton III. Violence is loud. It's immediate. It's satisfying in the moment. But it's also temporary. You can hurt someone physically, and they'll heal. You can threaten someone, and they'll find protection. You can act out of rage, and you'll create enemies who'll spend the rest of their lives trying to destroy you. But calculated power, strategic dismantling, that's permanent. When you understand how systems work, how money flows, how reputations are built, how influence operates, you can take someone apart without ever laying a hand on them. You can make them lose everything while they're still trying to figure out what went wrong. That's what Bumpy Johnson understood. That's what made him more dangerous than any street thug with a gun. He didn't just react. He planned, he studied, he identified weaknesses, and exploited them with surgical precision. And when he was done, his enemy wasn't just defeated, he was erased. That's power, not the kind that makes you feel tough in the moment, the kind that changes the world around you without anyone realizing you were the one pulling the strings. Charles Whitfield Peton III walked into Bergman and Sterling on October 10, 1964, believing he was untouchable. He believed his wealth, his name, and his connections made him immune to consequences. He was wrong, and by the time he realized how wrong he was, there was nothing left to save. Bumpy Johnson never spoke to Peton, never threatened him, never even let him know he existed. He just quietly, methodically, completely destroyed him. And then, he went back to his life, his family safe, his message delivered, his power reaffirmed. That's how you handle disrespect when you truly understand power. Not with fists, not with guns, not with rage, with intelligence, with strategy, with the kind of cold, calculated precision that leaves no room for recovery. Charles Whitfield Peton III learned that lesson the hard way. And everyone who heard the story, whether they knew the details or just sensed the outcome, learned it too. If you've made it this far, do me a favor, hit that subscribe button if you haven't already, and drop a like on this video. Stories like this need to be told, and your support makes that possible. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. October 10th, 1964. That's where this story started, with two women walking into a boutique on Fifth Avenue, dressed impeccably, carrying themselves with dignity, doing nothing more than exercising a right that had been denied to them for generations, and with one man blinded by hatred, emboldened by privilege, certain of his untouchability, who decided that their presence was an insult he couldn't tolerate. Charles Whitfield Peton III thought that afternoon would end with him reasserting the old order, reminding those women of their place, defending what he believed was his right to exclude and demean. He thought he'd won. He had no idea he'd just signed his own death warrant, not a physical one, but something far more devastating. The death of everything he'd built, the death of his reputation, the death of his power, because he'd made one fatal miscalculation. He assumed that power only belonged to people who looked like him, people who moved in his circles, people whose names appeared in the society pages. He never considered that real power, the kind that could reach into your life and dismantle it piece by piece, might be held by someone he'd never heard of, someone operating in a world he didn't understand, someone who didn't need recognition or validation because results spoke louder than reputation. Bumpy Johnson taught Charles Whitfield Peton III a lesson that day, even though Peton never knew who his teacher was. The lesson was simple. You are not untouchable. No one is. It doesn't matter how much money you have. It doesn't matter what your last name is. It doesn't matter how many powerful people you think you know. If you underestimate the wrong person, if you humiliate someone who understands power better than you do, you will pay a price. And sometimes that price is everything. This story isn't just about revenge. It's about justice in a world where the legal system didn't always provide it. It's about dignity in the face of hatred. It's about the quiet, calculated strength it takes to protect your family without becoming the monster your enemies expect you to be. Bumpy Johnson could have had Peton killed. In his world, that would have been easy. One phone call, one favor, one body that would never be found. But he didn't do that, because Bumpy understood something that most people miss. Death is mercy compared to destruction. A dead man becomes a memory, sometimes even a martyr. But a man who loses everything, who watches his empire crumble, who sees his reputation destroyed, who experiences the humiliation of falling from grace, that man lives with his defeat every single day. That's the kind of revenge that lasts. That's the kind of message that echoes. So here's the question I'll leave you with. What does power really look like? Is it the loud, aggressive display of dominance, the kind Charles Whitfield Peton III showed that day in the boutique, screaming slurs and throwing gowns on the floor, certain that his rage would be consequence-free? Or is it the quiet, strategic dismantling that Bumpy Johnson executed, the kind of power that operates in shadows, that moves pieces on a board you didn't even know you were playing on, that destroys you so completely you never even see it coming? The answer, I think, is obvious. Real power doesn't announce itself. It doesn't need to. It just acts. And by the time you realize what's happened, it's already too late. Charles Whitfield Peton III learned that lesson in the fall of 1964. And somewhere in Harlem, Bumpy Johnson went back to his life. His family protected, his point made, his legacy secured, not as a villain, not as a hero, but as a man who understood the rules of the game better than anyone else, and who played it perfectly. Thanks for watching. If this story moved you, challenged you, or made you think differently about power and justice, do me a favor, share it. Hit that subscribe button, drop a comment, and let me know what you took away from this. And I'll see you in the next one.